so-called variants in the Emily Dickinson poems. And so sometimes the variants are just a word, maybe 2 versions or more. You know, in the one I showed you, there are like 15 versions. So in some cases you have a slot in the poem, and you can fill in the word. And one of the things we were saying yesterday was, well, it's not necessarily like in the example of the poem I showed you where there were 15 different words. It may not be that you just pick one word. Maybe you have to think about all 15 words sort of shimmering like our iridescent fountain once again, shimmering in the slot or something like that. It's a little unclear what you do with that, but that's one possibility. Another possibility, and in that sense, if you think that all the words could go there at the same time or something like that, you're imagining them as somehow complementing one another. The alternative is that they substitute. One simply replaces the other, something like that. Then another thing, if you read this Sharon Cameron thing, another thing that Cameron raises the possibility is she says, suppose you have a poem and it has 3 different places where there's a variant. So here there's 2 words that could go, and here there's 2 words, and here there's 2 words. And then she says, well, you almost have to start, you can start to imagine all the different permutations, right? It's like if you take word 1 here and word 2 there and word 1 there, what happens? And if you take word 2 and so on, there's all these different combinations. And Cameron, she says, well, in some of these poems, you could really, sometimes it'll change the meaning a lot, depending on how you reshuffle the words, and sometimes it won't. Again, it's a little unclear what that means. Is that just by chance it doesn't change the meaning, or not? So I thought maybe the easiest way to look at this sort of didactically would be to start with 824, because this has a sort of a quote-unquote simple variant in the sense that the last 2 lines, there's 2 replacement lines. Now the poem's a little abstract, so it's hard, but I thought what we'd do is we would read the poem, and, well, let's read the poem aloud, and then let's interpret it ignoring the variant. Just do what we can with it. And then in a certain moment, we'll switch and we'll read it with the variant and see what happens. How we should read it, I'm not sure. That is to say, I'm tempted to say we should read it however we want. Whether that means we read it like a new critic would read it, we read it like Jameson would read it, we read it like a Dorman. We can do all these things. I don't. Let's do whatever we want. Let's see how it goes. So, would someone like to read this poem, 824 loud? It's lots of funny words. Anyone? No one? Okay, thank you.
From nearness to tremendousness, an agony to tears, affliction ranges boundlessness, ascending to laws. Contentment's quite separate, affliction cannot stay. An acre is its location, is it illocality?
Illocality.
Illocality.
Okay. So it's one of these things, I think the phrase is, it's deceptively simple. Which that phrase I always find deceptively complex. Like this, the phrase, it says it's deceptively simple. I think what that means is it looks simple, but it's not. But there's something about the way that the adverb deceptively works with it. I always think it could mean the reverse too. But anyway, I think it's deceptively simple. So we look at this poem. It's how many words? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 10, 13. 16, 19, 25 words, 8 lines, 2 stanzas. We have 4 dashes, 5, fifth is, no, sixth, I can't count. Anyway, we have 25 words or so. So the question is, so let's imagine, let's try to be really fancy, it's early in the morning, let's pretend. Let's imagine we're Adorno, and we're going to say, just for kicks, just an experiment, we're going to say, we really like what this poem does with one of the words in it. Which one? And there's not a right, I mean, it can be any of them. The point is just make a case. Which, I mean, when there's so few words, the poem does something with each of these words. And in a certain way, the poem may alienate us from these words. Not that these are necessarily common words anyway. Boundlessness, illocality, you might not say these words in the course of a month, but you might. But let's imagine, like, is there a moment in the poem where it takes a word that might seem common or normal or ordinary and somehow it makes the word seem strange to us? Or it takes a word that seems really annoying and does something cool with it. So I'm imagining now we're just going to intervene at the level of a word. And that's like an arbitrary intervention, like you don't have to. Could say that's the wrong way to go about things, but we'll just try it if it doesn't work with stuff. So suppose you had to pick a word to talk about. Which one would you talk about? Okay. Notice also just a grammatical, a historical thing. She writes IT apostrophe S the way today you would write ITS. That's not it is, that's possessive. Like, I mean, that's how you read it, it's possessive, but it looks odd because that's like what you're taught not to do. But that was just how she writes it. So that's means possession, not it is, but its location. Okay, location, why? Okay.
Which tends to imply something concrete, something that can be located.
Okay, good.
But that's kind of this word towards tremendousness and boundlessness, and also with the locality.
Okay. Okay, great. That's a great way to start, and that captures a lot of it. So we start out with this word location, and I think you put it really well. Location is a kind of reassuring word, like it tells you where you are, it tells you what's going on, right? The place, the location, the locale. So location. Location also implies orientation. It implies we're not lost. Not necessarily. What's your location? Well, I don't know what my location is, but at least it potentially implies the possibility of mapping, coordinate something. You have your phone tells you where you are, your location. Okay. But when you get to that word location, there's a way in which I think, again, it's very nice that the poem hasn't really prepared you for location because it's talked about boundlessness. And then the next line, its location is illocality. This is a very weird mouthful, but it's a very negative way to end. So, you know, the locus is the lack of locus. This, you know, something like that. It's a very strange way to sort of finish. Is there anything? But that's really that's a great start. So that's that word location. Now, is there anything in the poem that prepares us for the word location? So boundless. And the funny thing about boundless, of course, it's still linked by the sound. There's the L, and I only say that because there's the word that ends the first stanza of the laws. Boundless laws, location. There is this an illocality. I mean, there is this link on the level of the letter. But nonetheless, what is there anything else? Any other words that come before? I'm sorry? How come? Just the sound, or?
You could parade and just move. It seems to centers around the word affection or the description.
I'm sorry, what centers around affliction?
All these other expressions, the
Aha.
immensity of
Okay.
the affliction or agony, or the depth of affliction,
Mhm.
the unlocatable affliction. So, yeah, even contentment cannot, right? Yeah, so, sure.
And it's also repeated in both stanzas.
Affliction.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so yeah, affliction definitely, it somehow connects these things in a very specific way. There's also the word suburb, which is literally a locale, but it's sort of a secondary locale. It's a kind of derivative. It's not the center, it's the suburb. The urban, the suburban, or something like that. So it's sort of like an attendant. All right, so let's take this, and again, and partly actually why I was once upon a time interested in this poem, okay, I still am, was precisely this question of closeness, proximity. You know, one of the questions I asked the very first day in class, where I said it's sort of a background question for our seminar, is close reading. What does it mean to have all this authority accorded to the word close? And we saw one of the interesting things, you remember in the Demon, when he's talking about metaphor and metonymy, well, metonymy is based on a proximity, but a proximity that's not meaningful. Right? So the whole idea with metaphor was it connects things that are meaningfully related. The whole idea of metonymy is it connects things that don't have to be connected. Now the reason that's important is because metonymy then is somehow exposing proximity as potentially a false way to think about things. In other words, I don't know, we walk into the classroom and we say we're from another planet or something. We don't know how anything works here. We walk into the classroom, we look around and we're like, we don't know what any of this stuff is. Well, these two things are here on the table together, this and that. I'll assume they go together, right? The same way I might assume that goes with that. Now, in the one case, I would be right. In the other case, I'd be wrong. Not least because if you're wearing the gloves, you can't use the phone. So, maybe you can answer. No, not even that. So, that's a case where proximity would be misleading. In this case, proximity would be, by chance, would be correct. But it doesn't have to be. I could do that, and then it wouldn't be, or something like that. So, with metonymy, the way Damon was talking about it, partly that's potentially kind of threatening, because it's saying the fact that things are next to each other doesn't necessarily mean they go together. All right? You might say, okay, we know that. We know that. But notice that when we read poems, we almost always put a lot of authority on words that are closer to each other. We almost always proceed as though proximity of words is really, really, really meaningful. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a poem, right? Like if the order of the words didn't matter, how it wouldn't even be a syntax. It wouldn't be a language in a certain way. But nonetheless, Damon raises this funny thing of, well, but what if the fact that the words are together is just as misleading to the space alien who comes and says, oh, so you drink the water with a paperclip or something like that. That's now, I say this all as background because this poem is all about proximity, or about what proximity isn't. And so, yeah, I think location, let's put it this way. The first noun, a nearness. What's the difference between nearness and location?
The location is really precise. Nearness just sort of, it's somewhere there, and even it's so funny because it talks about tremendousness and boundlessness, and they both kind of imply this infinite space. And even when like in the first line, and nearness and tremendousness, the thing that nearness would kind of premodify or define tremendousness actually just makes it less precise because it's near. It's not, but how near? What is? what is actually, I mean,
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. A nearness, I mean, it's vague. It implies maybe comparison like nearer. Although it'd be, but I mean, it is very important that first line that you have the repetition of the sound, the ness, nearness, tremendous-ness. Right? I mean, the sound repetition is very important there. But yeah, I think you put that really nicely. It's like a nearness to tremendousness. It's almost oxymoronic. It's almost, it's not quite, but there's almost a point where it's like you were saying, close to far. I mean, it's, or, you know, near to tremendous. You know, it's like it's a mixed metaphor. There's something a little bit of kind of concatenation there in that first line. Things don't quite line up. And I think that's very typical of a lot of Dickinson. I think a lot of her poems, and these things are put together. But again, this poem is about nearness. It's about how things are put together. So that's our first example of something put together. Nearness and tremendousness are put together. A little strange. Nearness. So yeah, nearness is not location. It's somehow related. Where are you? Are you in Japan? No, I'm nearby. Relatively. A nearness to tremendousness, an agony procures. Affliction ranges, boundlessness, vicinity to laws. What does ranges mean there? It's kind of odd. But yeah, we started with nearness, and now we're at boundlessness. And so it's nearness, boundlessness, vicinity. So let's go on them.
I think there's this desire to try and impose a kind of like a spatiality, but it doesn't really work. His range itself denotes a kind of movement, right? Like left, right, or up, down.
Yeah. Okay, oh, so say that again. So you're saying there's an effort to kind of impose a sort of an order?
But it doesn't work. Like
Yeah.
some kind of space.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it seems like with each of these things we've mentioned, so location, nearness, ranging, vicinity, I mean, there's some effort to there's a kind of orientation, there's some effort to map, there's some effort to somehow, what's the word, schematize, right? Somehow, I mean, suppose you were going to draw this on the board. How would you draw this? Now, what is it actually? So, a nearness to tremendousness. So, is it correct? Is the summary correct? This is also where the syntax is a little weird. A nearness to tremendousness, and agony procures. So the subject is a nearness to tremendousness, and that procures agony. Is that how we read it? Or is it the agony that's procuring a nearness to tremendousness? What's the subject and what's the object? You think the former is the subject. I sort of agree. Why? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're wrong. Why do we think that? Why does it feel?
It kind of reminds me of the poem in the Cameron article about Madisoness.
Okay.
And how the closer you get to a kind of imminent force, it causes more pain.
Okay. Right, so being near to this tremendousness is somehow agonizing, produces agony. I guess the other reason I tend to read it that way is because it's the an agony. If you took the an out, I could read it the other way, like you can with affliction. Where, a nearness to tremendousness, agony procures. That seems to me more ambiguous, but when you put the an in, it seems more like an agony would be the object, not the subject. But that might be wrong. I mean, that's how I hear it right now. But that's very typical also of her syntax. That there would be you're sort of a little uncertain. Even in this, again, very simple structures, it's not an elaborate syntax at all. You're sort of uncertain, like, what is exactly the start? But then what's the grammar of the rest of it? Affliction ranges boundlessness, dash, vicinity to laws. What's the relationship between the last line and the previous three ones?
I don't know, but if I were to draw this on the board, it would be like a calculus, like math problem. You have domain and range, and you have like
Good try.
No, I just imagined it. Vicinity to laws, it's the closeness to laws. So we would pinpoint something closer to laws or something.
What's the domain like?
I don't know.
I know, I totally agree, like, I get the same feeling of the ranging, it's like, it does seem very mathematical. Like, there's a range across which you would describe this. But yeah, the question is, what are we trying to sort of capture with that? What's the feeling, or what's the vicinity to laws? So is vicinity to laws just a synonym for a nearness to tremendousness?
Sort of, but perhaps more tangible.
Okay.
Because the ness is removed.
Yeah. It takes out the ness. I mean, yeah, what's odd about, boundlessness, tremendousness, you're sort of substantivizing these adjectives, but in a very particular way. Okay, so then what happens in the second stanza? So contentment's quiet suburb, affliction cannot stay. And again, a very similar syntax. You could, again, I'm inclined to read contentment's quiet suburb as the subject, and it can't stave off the affliction. Arguably there, though, you could read it the other way. Or you could also read it, contentment's quiet suburb dash, affliction cannot stay. As in affliction can't stay in the quiet suburb. You think there's three ways you could read that. You like that one?
That's nice.
All right, yeah. In that case, stay is not so in other words, you see the difference between stay as a transitive verb and stay as an intransitive verb. So stay having a direct object, I stay that, as opposed to I stay. I stay in the classroom. In acres, its location is ill locality. Now again, there's also always this problem in Dickinson of how, where, like, contentment's quiet suburb, affliction cannot stay in acres. That's like a totally different way. In other words, if you don't stop at stay, you say, affliction cannot stay in acres. Its location is a locality. In other words, you can't map affliction. You can't show the acreage of affliction. You can't circumscribe affliction. You can't localize affliction. Its location is a locality. You sort of see how that, the other thing is, there's potentially then a contrast between the illocality of affliction, that can't stay in acres, and the idea of vicinity. Because it seems like being in the vicinity of the laws is the affliction, right? Or no, yeah.
I think the immeasurableness of affliction, the boundless, tremendousness, that itself is almost law, because you cannot, the status itself, the boundlessness of all the tremendous affliction,
Okay.
that
Okay. Yeah.
is close to all, that status itself is close to law, so vicinity to laws.
Right.
So you cannot locate that.
But then of course we're back to we're basically back to the first line of the poem, which is a nearness to tremendousness. In other words, what we're saying is the paradox of the poem is the affliction is being in the vicinity of the boundless. And vicinity, etymologically, it implies things that are localizable. It implies coordinates, points. So like the basic then contradiction in this is being in the vicinity of boundless. But that's almost sort of paradoxical. How are you in the vicinity of the boundless? The boundless has no bounding, hence you can't be near it. You're sort of necessarily included in it. But the weird aspect of this poem then is somehow like you're in the vicinity of something that itself has no vicinity.
I thought of the graph that you drew yesterday.
Like the asymptote?
Infinitesimal. So this seems to illustrate a certain aspect.
Well,
so you can forever reach or arrive at that particular moment that cannot localize that.
Maybe, although the thing about an asymptote, right, is that it does have a very specific coordinates. In other words, you have, like, it is bounded. Like the graph, coordination, the graph is bounded by the axes, right? So although it will never actually touch the axis, it will never cross it either. Whereas boundless seems to be more like that, potentially. But I know what you're talking about. I mean, there does seem to be that notion of being near a kind of impossible nearness, right? And I think this is important, going back to this idea of close, because some of these notions of, you get very close, and at the moment you're very close to the text, somehow you're very far away from it. I think one word for that is allegory. The fact that actually at the moment of greatest proximity to text, you're also in a certain way far away from it. James will talk about that a little bit, certainly Demandre. All right, so we have this basic. We have this word affliction, agony. It's this agony of being close to what cannot be in the vicinity, to what has no vicinity, to what is not proper to vicinity. It's also called, that she calls it a law is also very striking, because law would classically have the notion of definition, what has a boundary, what is, definere in Latin, what literally can be circumscribed, it can be bounded, So laws aren't boundless by their nature. Laws create boundaries, laws, and so on and so forth. Okay. So, I don't know, now, let's stop for a second. Let's just do a thought. I used to have this student, and he would always say, if you would allow me, please, a thought experiment. And everyone in class would go, okay. Like, we're afraid, like, what if we say no? And he did this for like 3 months. And then one day, finally, he said, allow me if you will. And I said, hold on, just for clarification. What's a thought experiment? We never figured it out. Like, he'd been doing this every time. What is it? And he's like, okay, allow me if you will, a thought experiment. All right, let's imagine this poem was written yesterday at Starbucks somewhere in Seoul, I don't know, somewhere. How could we imagine, again, it's completely artificial, how could we imagine talking about it in its social and political context? So not Dickinson's context, but our context. And I say that partly with an eye towards, remember what Jameson started talking about, and basically, I mean, Jameson says very explicitly, this fantasy of coming to the text with a blank slate is for him like the ultimate fantasy. You always come with so much baggage, right? You bring just, I mean, not least, you know the language, that's already, like the language, right? A language is itself more baggage than anything else, right? The very fact that you know a language means you know, so but for a million reasons you bring so much baggage to it. So let's pretend this is a contemporary poem, and it's somehow, thought experiment. Can't go do that. How could we think about, what if we're going to try to talk about it as like, in its social and political context? What would we even do? How would we do that? Completely artificially. And in a way, what you're asking to do is you're sort of saying, let's allegorize it. In other words, let's make it be about something. This goes back to what we were talking about the other day, you know, let's make it be about something it doesn't explicitly say it's about. You know, let's make it be, let's say, it says this, but what it's really talking about is that. Right? And often, you know, that's what sometimes gives literary studies a bad name. People think you just make stuff up or whatever. But, which may be, I mean, this is a thought experiment, this is not literary studies. But it is the fact that many texts do say one thing and mean another. So to deal with that fact. So yeah, how could we sort of like recode this or something and make it somehow, you know, somehow socio-politically situated in 2016? Or yeah, suppose you just read this, you didn't know who it was by. Your friend says, hey, look at this poem. It's really political. What would you think they meant?
If the writer was writing this in Starbucks in Seoul, I would say that a nearness to tremendousness would be like, a nearness to Seoul, the city, would be like agonizing because there were so many traffic jams and there are vicinity to laws, like there would be courts and all kinds of city laws that interfere with life. And contentment is quiet and suburb, so the outskirts of Seoul is more content. And affliction cannot stay, and in acres its location is so lucky. I'm not sure about the last lines, but I would say something about Seoul and its vicinities and suburbs or something.
Okay, so you would read that as sort of like an allegory of urban existence in the metropolis or something like that. Mm-hmm. Right? You're in this enormous metropolitan area, and you would sort of read it as yeah, an allegory of sort of the predicament of the individual in the metropolis. And what's really interesting about that is, you know, Dickinson herself, you know, she did not live in a big city at all, but it's almost, Dickinson's one of these poets where people construct these weird fantasy biographies around her, you know, and you have to realize, like, whenever, like, your received ideas about the lives of poets, these things are often literally confabulated by, you know, the editors who are trying to sell their books. So, for example, there are a number of very famous German poets. One in particular, this guy Novalis, was his pen name, who, you know, the story about him was, oh, he was this tortured, sick young man who died young. He was the romantic poet, blah blah blah. The guy was like a bureaucrat. I mean, he worked in an office, and at a certain point, like one of his editors was like, well, we're never going to sell him like that. I'll just make this. I mean, he makes stuff up. And then people read all the poems through this made-up biography. So the problem with Emily Dickinson, right, is there's this notion of, oh, she was the single woman who didn't marry, who was alone in her room, the spinster, right? It's this whole weird, potentially very sexist, but even more than that, just very complex cultural idea of, you know, sort of the lonely writer in her room, never going into the city. So that would almost prove your point. Like, this would also now be about, like, oh, this is her fantasy of you know, whatever, where she's somehow living in the suburb or the rural or something like that. But that in itself is all kind of like I say, it's almost kind of a myth about her. It's not, you know, actually she lived near some major colleges and she lived in a quite cosmopolitan place in certain respects. There weren't a lot of people, but it wasn't, she didn't live out in a hamlet on a hill or something. You know, sometimes you think like, you know, she's like a witch in a cave or something. The way people talk about it, you're like, it's so bizarre. You know, it's like, you know, she lived like right near like major intellectuals and, you know, you know. So that is almost a weird thing about the myth of Emily Dickinson is somehow like, oh, these would be the products of this isolated soul. She like went to lunch with, you know, I say intellectuals every day or something. You know, it's a very weird thing. But it does have that sense, yeah, I mean, the need, again, it's all the other side of the need to somehow locate, the need to plot, the need to map. And why? You know, why do we need to map? Anything else you could say about again, just we're doing a thought experiment. Like imagine you were going to somehow allegorize, you're going to recode this. You're Jameson or someone, you come along and you say, aha, this is really about X. Is there anything else we could say?
It reminds me of the late President Noonhyun.
Why?
He, after his period, he went to his maybe hometown but countryside, but some political matters extended from Seoul to his hometown.
He couldn't escape.
Yeah, so he was again involved in some political scandals.
Huh.
So a motif of such as birth and affliction ranges boundlessness.
Okay, okay, so that's very nice. So the notion of you can't bound these things. So you are the center of power, you're in Seoul, you're in the center of the world, you know, you're part of things, you leave all that, but somehow in this case moving doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't actually extract you from the situation. And again, even if, I mean, I like that, and again, even if we take out the specific details, you know, particular premiere, particular scandal, what that helps you identify in the poem is yeah, the need to make distance matter, and yet it doesn't. Right? The need, another way to put it is to say the poem is in some ways about, you want to be able to plot 2 points on the graph, not just one. And even if you can know they're somehow separate, they're not separate. Right? It's like I plotted 2 points on the piece of paper, but then the paper just bends and they touch again, or something like. There's some weird kind of, and that's why I like when you say it's like a calculus. You know, it's like you're mapping a function. There's also kind of geometry here. It's like you're trying to have a certain stable plane, but it contorts and so forth. So yeah, and again, that's sort of why the thought experiment is partly just to help one see like what are the sort of, you know, what are the underlying concerns, even if we just then make them more abstract, we don't make them specific to Seoul as a city or to this particular president or something. Anything else? If we were just going to, one more try with our thought experiment, is there anything else to somehow recode this?
It kind of reminded me of some people's experience to religion, and they need something transcendent all the time. I think in the past, like people try to kind of map God's positionality and where we would stand in relation to Him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this feeling of like, incredible awe and almost being dwarfed by this like boundless space that is whatever higher being.
And Dickinson, I mean, Dickinson's relationship to Christianity is very complicated. You know, there's some texts where it seems like, yeah, she's writing very directly about, you know, about transcendence, about engaging with Godhead and so forth. Then there are other poems where she seems to be kind of making fun of it, not in a derisive way, but just kind of playing with it in a way. So yeah, her relationship to Christianity, I mean, it's a huge, huge topic. But certainly the sense that this is somehow religious. Now notice, and this is partly why I wanted to do this thought experiment, notice that what we do each time we try to re-allegorize the poem is that we try to give it a certain kind of bounding, right? And so if you're going to say about this poem that the poem is an allegory of reading, the poem is partly about the need to be able to plot plot what's going on in the poem in a certain way, and yet in the course of doing it, you somehow undo your plotting, right? So like I was saying, like, you plot it out like that, and then the terrain shifts or something like that. There's a certain, but what we call doing a reading of the poem partly is bounding it in certain ways. And just to go back to the very first word, right? It's your second word. It's partly about nearness. It's showing how certain proximities are meaningful. And if you can't show those proximities are meaningful, you're in trouble. You can't really read it, right? You can't say what it's about. And again, that goes back to the metonymy problem. It's like if you can't, put it another way. Suppose I arrange some things on the table, right? If I can't explain that there's some meaning to the arrangement, I'm somehow not reading the text. Like I've got to somehow impose some kind of order. I've got to find some principle, some laws, or at least we have to be in the vicinity of some laws that will let us read the poem. Now it may be that these are laws specific only to this poem. There may be no other poem that has the same laws, but we gotta at least be close to them, or we just have a kind of a mess. But in a funny way, that's what the poem is about. It's about this effort to recode it, to re-laudify it. Okay, so that was all step one. Now we have our variant. So the last stanza would now read, contentment's quiet suburb, affliction cannot stay in acre or location, it rents immensity. What does rents mean there? Rents immensity.
In Dickens's time, does rent have the same implication as it does today, like I need to rent an apartment?
It does. Oh yeah, rents. They certainly had rents in the sense of prices on land and so forth. Payments, sure. But I'm trying to see, I wrote this down somewhere, like, here's what's weird about the word. So, rent, the sense we mean rent, like to let somebody use something for payment, comes from an old French word, rent, which is also, however, the root for the word to render. Okay, render in the sense of give, or cause to become, or make. So you say render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give Caesar his taxes or something. But you also say we will render it. We will. It rained and that rendered our picnic impossible. Or so that rent. And again, in Dickinson, you have to do this. Like the etymology of the word, she uses the word in very weird ways. So rent is related to render. What did I write? Hold on, that's only like one little part of it.
So that first class was in the rent is, another way of connecting the location space idea.
Right.
Right. So rent immensity.
Well, the other thing. So So rent also means is a noun. It means a tear in the fabric, like the rent in your pants. You ripped your pants. So and here it's a verb. It rents immensity, but that comes from the English word rend. It was rent. So like you rend in the sense of lacerate. Okay. And so so you then. There's a word to rend, you rip something apart. And so rent is related to that as well. So you have this, you have rent in the sense of it's related, to giving something for something, paying for something, pay the rent. The sense of rendering as in making and conditioning, and then also the sense of tearing. And all those things are in that word. And in fact, when you say the word rent, I hear almost the past participle, render, rent asunder, or something like that you say. Rended asunder, rented. Yeah, it's very, you hear all that. So contentment's quiet suburb, affliction cannot stay. So you can't stave off the affliction. Can't stay in acres. Its location is a locality, or in acre or location, it rents immensity, which means it both, it makes it, it creates it potentially, but also it tears it, it rends it, it divides immensity. Rips immensity. There's our philology. Look up the word. But what does that change? I mean, it's related like to wrench. It wrenches immensity. So if we read the variant, so pretend the first one wasn't there, we're just reading the variant. You're only reading the second version. What's different? Nothing. It's different, and yet is it different? Its location is a locality. In acre or location, it rents immensity.
I feel like with the variant, it's a bit more active, because as opposed to using the be passive verb is, as you said, wrench, like there's an attempt at ownership, or an attempt at trying to perhaps procure, but it may not work. So I feel like it's a bit more dynamic.
Okay.
Whereas the locality is kind of like you're letting go. You're saying, okay, no, this is
Location is a locality. Yeah, and the location is a locality has a little more the feeling of it's like a puzzle or a play on the word, whereas it rents immensity seems more statement. But I like that you'd link it then back to the word procure. It's nice. Acquiring, renting immensity, but then rending. Now, does the variant bother us, or we're just kind of like, yeah, we go with it. We're okay. We don't feel threatened by it.
I'm wondering what the it means. It's in the variant corresponds to location or reflection or acre or something.
I agree. Did anyone read the thing by Marjorie Perloff? Yeah, maybe not the thing about Emily Dickinson, the theory canon. Well, partly what she writes about, we're going to try our first snack now. Does anyone like a snack? You're all like, no, we don't eat that snack. We just give that to the tourists. Don't go wild, Mr. Tourist. Everybody said, oh, it's authentic. Yeah, sure. No Korean person has ever eaten. Now we'll see why. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Who brought this?
Pretty good.
Brought it on.
We do eat it, yes.
Yeah.
Irish food. I like it. What does it refer to? So, the very first day of class, someone mentioned the line, how do you tell the dancer from the dance, remember? Which is the end of this Yeats poem. Paul Damon has this sort of famous analysis of that. So, is it how do you or how can you? I don't know, I can't remember. How can you tell the dancer from the dance. And now, what is that normally taken to mean if you know this poem? Or even if you don't know the poem? How can you tell the dancer from the dance? What does that mean? I don't even know if you've ever heard of a poet. You can probably guess what it means. How can you tell the dancer from the dance? What does that mean? No idea. Too obvious? Someone say the obvious.
It just reminds me of this, how can you tell from the tree from the woods?
And that's what the poem is about. The poem is about organic continuity and exactly like. So yeah, it's sort of saying like the dancer and the dance are so intimately interconnected you can't really separate them. They're almost one and the same or something like that. But and what that means is that normally that line is read as a so-called rhetorical question, right? Which means you're not actually asking how, you're saying you can't. That's the so-called rhetorical question. Now, what Demond does is he looks at this and he says, there's a problem, which is this is at the end of a poem about the relationship between different things in nature. And he says, you can read the poem one way, so that would be the punchline, and the punchline would be, you can't tell them apart, and there's continuity and everything's connected. He's like, but there's another way you could read the poem, where, in fact, the poem is all about the fact that you really do need to be able to tell these things apart. And if you read it that way, when you get to the last line, there's a sense of urgency, like, how can you tell the answer? Like, not a rhetorical question anymore, but a sense of, like, you really need to be able to tell. So, what's the point? Well, Demond's point about that is to say that's an example of what he calls the disjunction. In other words, there's one grammar. The grammar doesn't change, but it can have two entirely different meanings. In the one meaning it says, you can't tell. In the other meaning it says, how? It's a real question. But there's no way to know from the grammar itself what it means. You have to read it, quote unquote, in the poem or in there's no way just from that sentence to know if it's a rhetorical question or not. It can be or it cannot be. Now, Demond, there is a point to all this, we're getting back to it, not pure digression. Demond calls that undecidable. And what he means by that is there is no way from the grammar to decide how to read that sentence on its own. Now, go back to the Dickinson and the word it. The question is the word it in Dickinson, well, first of all, is it ambiguous in the sense that it could be more than one thing? Or is it undecidable in the sense that Demond is talking about where there's no way to, as it were, privilege one version over another? And I say this all because in this essay, which we may not really talk about, but this essay by Marjorie Perloff about Emily Dickinson, Perloff wants to say that these its, and she specifically uses examples of it in Dickinson, these its in Dickinson, yeah, they can be somewhat ambiguous, she says, but they're not undecidable like that. It's not that big a stress. In other words, when Demond identifies that, it's supposed to be this big crisis. And Perloff wants to say that in Dickinson, you have ambiguities, but they're not that threatening. If that makes any sense. That like, yeah, but even if you read the different versions, they all, in other words, the different versions kind of go together. They don't, so in other words, we say, oh, it is ambiguous in this poem, but the consequences aren't great. We don't get the completely contradictory interpretation. Again, that's an argument. That may be wrong. So let's see. So, it rents immensity. What could it be referring to? What are our options? This is hazelnut, right?
It is okay.
I'm allergic to hazelnuts, that's all right. I won't go into anaphylactic shock or anything. Strange things may happen. No, please don't know why.
Seeking attention.
What can it refer to?
The two options. The fact that the whole sentence, affliction cannot stay in acre or location, rans immensity, or affliction, rans immensity, or.
Oh wait, so you're saying it could refer to the whole sentence. Affliction cannot stay in acres, its location. No, I'm sorry. Affliction cannot stay in acre or location. It rents immensity. And you're saying it can refer to affliction. What were the other options? Whose concern was this immediate? Wait, this was your concern. What did you think? What were the alternatives?
Right before acre or location or affliction. Any noun could really mean it, couldn't it? Or maybe not.
Well, that's a good question. There's a temptation to read, this is a weird thing, right? Like, what's the rule in English? What is the antecedent to a pronoun? Our former wonderful president, George W. Bush, had this fear of pronouns and their antecedents. That is to say, he didn't think they would work. So he would say things like, the terrorists hate freedom. They hate it. Freedom, as if you weren't sure, as if it was ambiguous. Like anytime he'd use a pronoun, it's like he'd be afraid you weren't sure what the antecedent was and he would repeat the word. He's like, they hate us. The United States. Is that what you're saying? Like, there's never, like, he never would just say they hate, freedom, they hate it. He'd think the it was ambiguous. It was almost like he was afraid you couldn't use pronouns. You have to be language only nouns or something like that. But what's the rule in English? What is the rule? What's the antecedent to the pronoun? The problem is in English, it's not as well rule bound. Like in German, it's much more precise. How's it work in Korean? You have such similar problems. It does not work syntactically. Like, what's the rule? What's the antecedent to the pronoun?
Right before it, so.
Yeah, I mean, usually the rule is whatever is the previous noun. Like in German, that would be very specific. But in English, it's a little weird here because the syntax, contentment's quiet suburb, affliction cannot stay. And again, part of the problem is you don't know what to do with the third line. In acre or location, if you think in acre or in location is the prepositional phrase that begins the second sentence, then it could refer back to affliction. But if you think in acre or location goes with the previous sentence, affliction cannot stay in acre or location, then it could potentially refer to location or to, it depends. Here's the problem is how you put the sentences together starts to matter. Does line 3 go with line 2 or does it go with line 4? And then the balance of what it's referring to could be a little different. But again, the underlying concern is not that specific detail. The underlying concern is, does it matter? In other words, like I said, Damon was giving examples of texts where you really can't determine something, but as a consequence, it completely reverses the meaning of the poem. In other words, if that line about the dance and the dance means one thing, then Yeats's poem is all about symbolic unity of the world. If it means the opposite thing, his poem is all about how everything is divided. It's literally night or day. It's one or it's completely different. It all changes on that one thing. Does it change the poem here, which one we decide? Or, and this is what this Marjorie Perloff article is saying, she's saying, yeah, there's going to be all these ambiguities, but the different versions will kind of all go together. It won't mess things up. It won't create this either or, plus minus, night-day kind of thing. So does it mess up our reading of the poem if we don't know which this is, or does it not matter? Not so clear. thoughts, views?
I didn't have that much problem because the word immensity is all connected with those all boundlessness of tremendousness or boundlessness. And so nearness, all those huge and unmeasurableness. So it didn't matter that much of the experience.
Yeah, and maybe precisely because it's the lessness, the tremendousness, the lessness, the lack of boundary and all that and so forth. It just seems like it might add to the confusion or to the sort of indeterminacy or something like that. Yeah. It rents. I mean, it partly, in acre location, it rents immensity. I mean, the only thing I would say is immensity goes sort of more with tremendousness, sense of magnitude and so forth. Immensity, in a funny way, might be at odds with boundless. I mean, they can be synonyms, but they could also be not exactly synonyms. I'm not sure. Well, let us do the following. So the other poem we were going to look at was 340, right? Is that correct? I felt a feeling in my brain. Was that right? Okay. Which, if just I point out, interestingly, the last stanza of that, and then a plank and reason broken, I drop down and down, that in some ways relates to 926, which is about stepping from plank to plank. Now you can tell by the numbering, these are numbered chronologically. She probably wrote the plank to plank maybe a year later. But a lot of her poems are in dialogue with one another in very interesting ways. Like the same motifs come up there. So when you see like the same things happening in different poems, even across the oeuvre, they often are like in conversation with each other. So I would say. Let's see. Why don't we spend 10 minutes before we take a break? Let's very briefly start talking about the Jameson, and then when we come back after the break, we will try to sort of put into effect some of his views and look at 340 in some detail. So, if some of you read Jameson before, it seems like you have. Jameson's a more known commodity. He's still, I don't think he's yet retired. I think he still teaches.
Isn't he like 90?
He's old. And not, as I recall, the healthiest guy, but some of these guys, they never die. Well, like Harold Bloom. You ever heard of Harold Bloom? Harold Bloom, okay, when I was your age, Harold Bloom, you thought, so I used to study with him, and he looked so unhealthy. Like, he would start coughing in class, and this was before cell phones right now. We would sit there looking at each other thinking, like, how do you call an ambulance? The guy's gonna die. This is back in the 1980s. He'll probably outlive me. Like, he's one of these people who just seems eternally like he's about to die. He'd be like on his deathbed for 100 years or something like that. But Jameson, Jameson, he's still teaching. He's not. He retired. It was only recently. He's still writing. He's still publishing books and so forth, for sure. Okay. So we know about Jameson a bit. Just in the preface to this text he read, what is he saying? What is his basic shtick? What's he concerned to tell us? The first thing he says is this famous line, always historicize. And then the first thing he says about that is, well, this can mean two different things. What are the two different things that can mean? He says there's the subjective and the objective. Actually, I always get confused by the way he talks about this. What's the subject and what's the objective? Just like on the very first paragraph. He says there's two distinct paths, although they will meet in the same place. Which is itself a weird claim, maybe. I don't know, maybe it's more interesting if they don't meet the same place. But anyway, he says they will. So what are the two things? We have the subject, we have two options. We're always historicizing. So we have the Emily Dickinson poem, and we're gonna historicize it. So what are our two options?
We're going to contextualize it in time and location.
And that's objective, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're going to contextualize it in time and location. What else? What else on the objective side? So it's not just, yeah, I mean, so let's be more specific. All right, we're going to contextualize the Dickinson poem in time and location. So, I don't know, it's probably 1860. What does that mean? What do we do? We don't just give it a date. Good, but what else? What?
Is the whole world happening? Or it will happen soon?
Yeah, you're right. You see, right there, your knowledge of American history is better than most Americans. Say 1860, they go, Thomas Jefferson? No. Yeah, and that's actually a very interesting thing. Speaking of this sort of allegorizing, like Dickinson doesn't write poems that are explicitly about the battles of the Civil War, but many people have argued that she in many ways is a war poet. That actually, if you look more closely, you'll see that indeed, that she's writing during the Civil War, absolutely, in the 1861 to 1865 Civil War, she's writing during that. And people have argued that actually in many ways she is a war poet, so it's not, but again, it's one of those things that it's never stated explicitly. It's somehow allegorized. But all right, so we're doing the objective. We're situating it. What do we have to do according to him? He says, in his phrase, he says, we have to study the historicity of its forms and its. This is all the objective one. The historical moment of emergence of its linguistic possibilities, the situation-specific function of its aesthetic. Well, what is all that? What does that mean? Sounds nice. What does it mean?
Perhaps in the case of Dickinson, the fact that she was in New England, there was a certain, it wasn't she surrounded by Thoreau and Emerson, but there was a very particular aesthetic within.
Okay. She was writing in the American literary tradition. People like Thoreau and Emerson had established certain ideas aesthetically. She had read them. She's always potentially in dialogue with Emerson. Could be other aspects. I mean, she, you might know something about other European authors she'd read and so forth. Possibly about religion, history of religion in the United States. How her, I know she's a Puritan, exactly. But yeah, her, you might know something about the sort of function, the ideological function of the religious motifs that she uses.
Or particular use of languages, the terms in that region, or in that period.
And even like yesterday when we started talking about the dashes, and I was saying, oh, well, if you look at the grammar books they were using at the time, or even today when I said, her punctuation, the its, its, different kinds of punctuation you would want to know about other people who are writing poetry contemporaneous with her. What were the norms, linguistically, her capitalization, etc. Historical I mean, and then you would probably want to know something about the particular form of poem she wrote, this kind of non-rhyming hymn. Could you? And again, people have done studies of this. You could, put her in a whole tradition of hymns, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, could do all that. That's so-called the objective. And then the alternative is the subjective, which is what?
An act of interpretation. Our understanding is how we interpret the text.
Yeah, foregrounding the interpretive categories or codes through which we read and receive the text in question. Now we have been, in this class, we've been very artificially doing precisely that. We've been saying, here's what a new critic would say we should do, let's try to do it. We've actually been, these have been our thought experiments, like trying to play these games, as it were. There is a danger in that artificiality in that it might make it seem easier than it really is to do that. In other words, it's very easy, you're in class and someone says, all right, we just read Cleon's book, let's pretend to be Cleon's books, what would he say about the poem? That's something artificially simple. When you actually say, all right, you sit down at home and you're going to read anything, what are the interpretive codes and categories and methods that you're bringing to bear? Yeah, it might get a little harder. It might get a little harder. It might not be so easy for you to identify. And this goes back to what I was saying yesterday. You know, part of what these authors helped you see is how you have a lot of presuppositions that you didn't know you have. But let's think about it. Yeah, like this symphony is not a poem. Like, all right, a novel. When you read a novel, say you're reading a contemporary novel, so a novel read in the last 10, 15 years. What interpretive codes or categories do you bring to bear? Maybe not consciously ever, in a novel. Again, you can be reading for fun or reading for classes, and I'm not sure it matters. But what are the interpretive categories? How do you read the novel? Or let's put it this way, what's the last novel you read for fun? Anyone think of a novel? You can't remember that? I meant like not assigned in class. You can't remember? You're overburdened students, bedraggled, overworked. Oh, come on. What? Atonement.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I couldn't have read that. I just recently read, do you know who this Bulgakov is? The Russian writer in the 30s. He wrote a book called Master and Margarita. Probably, I'm sure it's translated to Korean. It's very, amazing book. Okay, so you read this Atonement. So how did you read it? What were you reading for?
I didn't expect that question.
No, but well, okay. So you have a contemporary novel. I don't know. Is there like in the United States? There's like there are all these novels that are sort of written like by hipsters in Brooklyn that are all sort of about being hip in Brooklyn, and they're sort of vaguely satirical, but they're very sort of self-referential. Do you have the equivalent in Korean? Like there must be the sort of hipster fiction. Well, but okay, if you're I don't know, the beach. Do you go to the beach? I don't want to go to the beach. The beach is a metaphor. You're at the beach with a book. You're reading something. You're reading a detective. Yeah, okay. You're reading a detective story, a detective novel. What interpretive categories do you bring to bear, if any? Interpretation is maybe almost, well, that's the thing, like sometimes you think, like, well, I'm not interpreting it, I'm just reading the story. Is that occurring to you, that that's one of the problems? Or is that false? Are you always interpreting?
I think when it comes to things like a speech reads, your preconception is that it'll be light and not serious.
so you can kind of flip through the pages easily.
Okay, so yeah, that's, what does that mean? It's light and not serious, therefore you can read it faster. Fast reading, not slow reading. But what are you really not doing? In other words, you could be reading quickly, you're late for class, you're supposed to read the last 50 pages, you're like, you need to, what will you be doing differently if you're reading at the beach? Are you reading a detective story, which is overtly a puzzle, like who did it, you don't know. But you trust it'll tell you. So what's different than if you've been told, go and read Kafka or something? Why are you under less pressure?
You don't have to deconstruct the text or interpret it, or you don't have to see it as something you have to dissect. You can just read it for fun or pleasure.
Okay, so that's sort of the assumption. We're not sweating the details. But is that true? In other words, I mean, for example, like, have you ever with a friend talked about a book that you've read for pleasure that you really, really, really enjoyed? You probably could talk about it in a very systematic way. Like I remember once, it's depressing, one of my oldest friends, the longest conversation we ever had about literature together, ever have had, he's still alive, the longest conversation was an argument about Harry Potter, about whether or not Snape was evil at the end of book 6. And our knowledge, embarrassingly enough, our knowledge of these first 6 volumes of Harry Potter was exhausted, and we debated endless details, going on and on and on and on and on. It was really embarrassing. But this was all fun reading. But maybe precisely because we liked it, we remembered it, and we could like do a lot with it or whatever. We weren't trying to, we weren't like, trying to be fancy or something. We were just debating, is the guy evil? I mean, it was really, in some ways, rather dumb. Why not? But, yeah. I guess what I'm saying is, could we put pressure on this distinction? Is it not the case that when you're reading for fun, maybe when you're reading for fun, you are doing all the same things to a degree that you'd have to, that no one will call you on it if you don't. Like, no one will say, hey, in class, on page 9, did you notice the da-da-da? You're like, I didn't know. But is it really the case? I guess what I'm asking is, can you really turn it on and off that easily? In other words, is your professional reading, your scholarly reading, really so different from your lay reading? Is it really so different?
It might be the case that if you're reading for fun, you might be more attentive to the details than rather than...
That's what I'm wondering. I'm saying like, yeah, I mean, you know people that certain books, they virtually know it by heart, they like it so much. That doesn't mean they'll necessarily analyze the details, but they certainly, but are they not? Maybe they are. And that would be one question. In other words, is the very fact you like a book somehow evidence that you may have done more work on it? Again, I'm not saying I'm not speaking how suggestible. I'm trying to think, like, you know, when we talk about, again, when Jameson says something like, what are the interpretive categories or codes through which you read the text, and you're like, I'm reading the Agatha Christie, or I'm reading Harry Potter at the beach, I don't have interpretive categories and codes. And I think James would probably say, yes, you do. The question is, what are they? Now, in many ways, Harry Potter is a good example, right? Because it plays with all these very standard conventions of British boarding school fiction and hero fiction and I mean, it's playing with all these genre expectations, so that naturally you are reading it as, you know, as partly as children's literature, as partly as young adult. You know, there's all these ways that you're conditioned to read it. If you're so cursed to have read Harry Potter. All right, I guess we should take a break. Should we eat some of our snacks? Everyone want a snack? I recommend the hazelnut.